All right, guys, appreciate you being on. I guess first step, so we're going to talk about hip-shoulder separation, kind of go through our own experiences, define terms, talk about how we might train it, coach it with athletes. But I guess first things first, just kind of introducing you guys. Hunter, Drew, Corey, all three of you guys have been upper 90s throwers at one point or another. All three of you guys have, had your struggles, had to really figure it out, develop yourselves. So I feel like there's some unique and different perspectives here, and hopefully we agree on some things and we kind of disagree on some things as well. First question to kind of pose to you guys is, how would we just off the bat define hip-shoulder separation? Corey, do you have an answer to that?
I would say the way, generally most people look at it is just like, all right, just turning shoulders left and right, just in the transverse plane. So just how much rotationally the shoulders are separated from where the hips are.
Right. I think my viewpoint would be a little bit more three-dimensional. So I think even when I'm throwing by myself, it's like I would view this as like a degree of separation, then like rotation obviously has its degree of separation, and then also add an extension. So it's like a very three-dimensional like form of separation, almost like a spectrum. Like there's guys that are like really rotational and that's how they create separation. There's guys who are like more extension flexion, and then there's like obviously the combination of all of that, which is everybody.
And that kind of gets into the next piece, which is like, why would separation matter in the first place? And you kind of alluded to it there, is like we're talking about creating this stretch through all the different like myofascial elements. And so again, our bodies are three-dimensional. It's not just like we get a max stretch in the transverse plane. There's that linear separation, if you want to call it that, front to back, and then there's also that extension sagittal plane separation. So you can almost think of it as like that three-dimensional winding of everything that's going on. Why exactly would hip-shoulder separation be beneficial in the first place? Like why might there be a correlation there to velocity?
Yeah, so when we think about the whole process of creating a stretch, anytime that I'm able to lengthen the entire process before I'm actually able to fire the projectile, I'm usually going to be able to create more force, therefore adding torque to the body, therefore increasing ball velocity. So that's usually the general purpose of creating a separation, just to allow the body to actually stretch, to actually be able to apply more force.
What do you guys think are some of the misconceptions here? Because like, I know for me, 10 years ago when I was trying to figure this stuff out, I just kind of assumed like, okay, hip shoulder separation, everyone says it's good, more must be better. It should be like max hip shoulder separation. We should all look like Tim Lincecum or whatever when we're throwing. Corey, do you have an opinion on that? Like, how do we know what's optimal for us? Is it just like everybody should be chasing max hip shoulder separation, or is it individual? How do you think through that?
I can speak to this from multiple aspects, but I'd say from like a personal training experience, like in college when I was probably at my throwing probably the slowest and just didn't feel good, I was so flexion extension biased that I actually wasn't getting much rotational separation at all. So trying to, like in the next year or two after college, like my fix there was like, all right, get as much rotational separation as possible, and then once you land, like try to close that gap. And so I think both of those are probably not the play, but I went from basically none to as much as possible. And then for me, basically the way I kind of figured out, hey, how much is too much, is just trial and error. Just, all right, let me try to separate a ton. Oh, that's not great. Separate 0, that's not great. And then somewhere in between, the velo kind of just like pointed to that's probably close to the right amount. So from a playing experience, like that's kind of how I figured it out. Now there's definitely a faster way that doesn't take as much trial and error, but personally I would say that's how I kind of like figured it out. I don't know about you guys.
For me, I think like building on that, I got a lot of those similar experiences, but for me as well, like just thinking back to what I did, I remember I used to almost just start like as closed as I could be and then just try to shoot the hips forward. And then as I got a little bit better at throwing, like more trial and error, it was almost like just try to remain neutral until the last second. And then you can almost just apply a little bit of force this direction. And that's as the hips are unfolding. And then that creates all your separation there at the last second. And that seemed much more sustainable, easier to like reproduce, throw hard, especially in game as well. Instead of just starting like here and then just trying to hold it and being really tense, like I could almost just stay completely neutral and then the last second just give a little whatever, and then that creates the separation at the last second.
Yeah, I had a very similar experience there where like for a long time I had no idea how to create any sort of separation. I would just kind of rotate as a big block, land open, like threw relatively slow for almost all of high school, pretty much all of college, until I kind of figured that out. But for me, it was like initially just forcing it. It was like, okay, well, if I can't figure out how to do this, I'm just going to like start max thoracic rotation, max pelvic rotation this way, and just like try to hold that and not lose it by the time I got to landing. It kind of worked. Like I got up to 95 that way, but it ultimately didn't feel like the most sustainable pattern. Like it kind of felt like there was a lot of stress being put on my back in that position. And ultimately when I, figured out the drift, figured out like what you're talking about, like the full leg lift, sequencing it all up, it just felt like a much more sustainable pattern to get that separation later on in the throw instead of just trying to like brute force it and hold it throughout the entire time.
The big misconception, I mean, we were doing that at the same time. It's like we were training at the park at the same time. We were both doing the exact same thing. Big turn, try and hold for forever, and I don't know, probably didn't feel too great all the time. But yeah, probably big misconceptions, more is not always better. But having more is better than having none. So in that aspect, like if you have none, it's going to be really, really difficult to actually be able to close this gap here.
Right. If you don't create a gap at any point, there's nothing to close.
There's nothing
if you just
to
land,
close. You're essentially just already throwing the projectile in this linear fashion. So it's just, if you don't have any, you're toast. But if you have too much, your obliques are ruined. Fascial lining's probably not great.
That's something that I wasn't necessarily aware of until 4 or 5 years ago when I started to see more examples of guys who I would consider like too loose or maybe had too much separation, because I'd never considered like there could be such a thing as too much. You just see like, you would see pictures or videos of like MLB guys like Aroldis Chapman and be like, okay, well, more must be better. Like the fact that Aroldis Chapman makes it work is partly because he sequences so perfectly. He's super strong. Like he's able to not just create that gap, create that space, but then he has the ability, the timing, and the strength, the stiffness to actually close that gap too.
Correct.
So we've seen examples of guys, in the facility where like they get into crazy positions and then they just like throw poo.
Yeah.
Because they're like overly loose and they don't have that ability to create space and then close that space quickly. Corey, maybe speak to like a couple examples, Cortez maybe being one, where like not necessarily a guy with like the most separation, but talk about like the sequencing of that and how it's way more about the timing potentially than just the gross like number or degrees of separation.
Right. So I mean, I think with some of the harder throwers, even though we've seen it in here this summer, the timing of separation kind of matters more than the amount, I would say. And you can kind of see that, some of the guys that are, pretty quick twitch, it's, hey, separation's late, so the hips have a chance to, go without the torso, and then the torso is just kind of right behind it, where you're actually trying to, carry that energy up the chain from the lower aft to the hips to the shoulders. So I mean, I think for the most part, some of the harder throws we've seen, they're peaking separation before they're actually landing, and that's allowing kind of a smooth transition into the actual finish of the throw. The timing matters more than the amount, but you definitely want a certain amount just so you can, you want the pelvis to actually, or the hips to kind of have a certain amount of energy in them, and then you want to be able to actually transfer that to the next segment. And if they're working together, then it's going to be really hard to actually transfer that to this, because this is already going to be moving. So for there to be energy flowing up the chain to the arm, you need to have the sequence needs to be hey, if the hips have to go before the torso, then there needs to be some level of separation there.
Speak to this idea of deceleration as well, because we talked about closing the gap. Like let's kind of tie in how this idea of deceleration plays into the picture, because it's not just about like how much can we actually open the gap, but to close the gap, we need to be able to get our pelvis open and then be able to slam on the brakes so that our trunk can then accelerate from there. I'd say
the biggest thing when I think about it is when you look at some of the biomechanical data, the energy isn't flowing up necessarily from the front side. So it's not just like, all right, land here, separated, and then the flow is like, all right, front hip to arm. It's actually still coming from the back side. So it's one general flow of energy up. It's not like, I think the point of like, all right, if you were to say you need max separation like at landing, that would be assuming that you're sending the energy up from the front leg versus, all right, just there being the the right amount of separation at the right time allows for everything to flow like into the throw. It's not necessarily the energy's kind of flowing up from here to here. It's that generally like, all right, the hips rotating is what's actually kind of like sending it up to the arm.
One thing I think is worth pointing out too is like how our spines are designed to work is segmentally, and that kind of speaks to this idea of like forcing it, like just like forcing the top half of this spinal column to just like hold that position isn't really how our spines are designed to work. It's more so designed to be able to function segmentally, L5, L4, L3, L2, and be able to move in a kind of a wave-like pattern. So I think that's certainly one piece of it. Another analogy that I think is helpful is this whip-like analogy, right? If we think of the delivery as like you're creating a whip, there you need to be able to create space through each segment of your body. We can all think of like if you have a whip you don't want like a piece of string that just has no tension to it, but you also don't want like a baseball bat. Like that's not going to whip because it's just all the segments are stuck together. So I was talking to Jimmy Buffy about this, and one way he kind of described this, which I thought was interesting, in terms of like describing the whip-like mechanism, there's the hip-shoulder separation. So there's the dissociation between the pelvis and the trunk. That's one piece of creating the whip. But then what's the next piece of that whip? And he kind of described it as, he thinks of scap retraction as like trunk to arm separation. That's like, if this is not separating, then this just all moves as one. But if you can separate the scapula and the arm from what the torso is doing, that's like the second link there. And then he thinks of the final piece of separation is like elbow extension, flexion to extension. So separation from the upper arm to the lower arm. But you're just describing that wave-like motion, because otherwise pelvis and trunk rotating together, arm and trunk rotating together, or the upper arm rotating together, you never actually get that true like wave or whip-like mechanism.
And I think that's kind of like another reason why you don't want max separation between hips and shoulders, because if you're only focusing on separation between hips and shoulders, like you're also missing out on, hey, at some point the torso needs to take off to create the next level of separation. At some point the shoulder needs to take off to create the next level of separation. So if you're only worrying about like, oh, this is the only transfer that matters, you kind of end up missing out on the all right, it actually has to transfer like to the arm, to the hand, to the ball. Like if you only focus on hip shoulder separation, then you'll miss out on kind of those next layers. So
what's the general range like we've been seeing so far on the mocap for hard throwers? 30 to 50?
Yeah, right around there. I mean, it's different. You'll see guys naturally just get more separation or get less. And I think within subject, like somebody can create a scenario where hey they have tension somewhere and don't create as much separation throw to throw, but I think generally also you'll see guys that are more have more range of motion at the spine, have more range of motion at the hips, be able to create a little bit more and still have everything kind of flow up. But yeah, I mean, depending on the system, it's going to be a little bit different. But yeah, like anywhere from 30 to 45 to 50 is kind of generally what we're seeing. So
one thing I'd be interested to like see over time as we gather more data is figuring out if we can somehow bucket guys based on like loose, like moderate kind of flexibility tight guys, and then seeing like for each bucket what type of separation might be optimal for them. Because if we're just putting everybody in the same bucket and saying like, oh, here's a tight moving 95 mile an hour guy, here's a super loose 95 mile an hour guy, it kind of like muddies the data a little bit.
Sure.
But you might see maybe a guy with like only 45 degrees of T-spine rotation in one of our screens, like he gets bucketed differently from the guy who has like 80 degrees of active T-spine rotation. Because maybe like creating 45 degrees separation for the guy who has like 80, maybe that's like not enough. But maybe creating 25 for the guy who has 45 is like the sweet spot. So I'm curious over time if we can kind of figure out like, currently we kind of know there's a trial and error part of the process, but if we can almost hone in on that a little bit more based on the amount of available range of motion a guy has, just to kind of explain like one of the main screens you can do to like see how loose a guy is for this purpose is any sort of T-spine rotation screen. So we'll use a quadruped T-spine rotation screen. I mean, I can just demonstrate it, but
Go for it.
Essentially locking your hips down, hand behind the back, opening up. And we'll typically see about 70 degrees is like really good on that type of screen. You might see guys get to 80. Honestly, we've seen 90 degrees before. And then you'll see the super tight guys, they get like 30, 40 degrees of T-spine rotation. So you kind of know like what the absolute ceiling would be, and you're almost never going to see the separation actually get to that ceiling. If they got 70 degrees, you're probably not going to see more than 50 of actual separation in their mechanics.
Isn't there a generalized number though? There's been enough mocap data published. There's a generalized number.
Yeah, I mean,
42.
it's still a range. Like, that's still an average. I just think it's never going to be exact. I mean, there's just so many ways to throw. There's just never going to be an exact, like, oh, you need this exact number. But yeah, I mean, there's a generally accepted kind of like range there.
Do you guys have an opinion on, again, there's different ways to create that separation. We talked about forcing it, but there's also like more pelvic driven, and then there's more upper half or counter rotation driven. Do either of you guys have, some opinion about, or at least maybe want to explain the different types and how you've kind of experimented and played through that?
I think just as a general rule, I'll start coaching guys with the focus being on creating it with the upper half, just because day to day you do so much stuff with your hands, and I think just proprioceptively, like, you're much better at controlling the upper half, like, while you're doing something. So that's typically where I'll start. And if for whatever reason, like, we can't find a feel for that relaxation, like creating the separation that way, then maybe you go into some like lower half stuff, like type feels, patterning, maybe CBB, like maybe some things like that to just assist with like, okay, like you're gonna almost then keep the torso like neutral and then just feel the hips rotate underneath. Whereas I think as a default, like we talked about Rollins a lot, maybe we start with the hips open and then creating or closing the upper half to create that separation. And it's obviously solving the exact same problem, but one guy might be able to like think of it better as like upper half driven, and another guy might be able to conceptualize it better as like, okay, I'm gonna hold this still and then let the hips unfold underneath me.
So there's a few different ways to create the separation. There's like, you can be like Garrett Cole, where he's like getting all of it from, he's staying neutral, and then it's just like pelvic rotation underneath the torso. There's, way more getting it like from the trunk counter rotating as you move forward. And then there's some combination of the two where you get some of it from the hips opening, some of it from the trunk closing off even more as you stride down the mound. But it's ultimately getting to the same end result at landing.
Sure.
What are some other, common ways that you guys might coach or teach it? Or maybe like, let's first go over like mistakes. Like, what are some mistakes or ways guys would cheat separation that you'll commonly see?
The first big mistake is the big glove side move. So it's not necessarily like I'm going to turn my whole torso, but I'm going to take my glove side back here and then just try and hold that for forever. It's just not going to work. I don't think that you can force it with this to try and get back there, but I think it's more of I think if you have like a little bit of a gradual move as you start going for, at least from like this direction, even if it wasn't like a leg lift, even if it was just here where it's almost relaxed instead of like a big full body turn, glove side goes to second base. Like, I think
so controlling the front side of the top half more from the center of the body and the torso versus trying to use the glove arm too.
Yeah, just more like in your abdomen at least, where it's more of just trying to feel like everything is slowly turning into it. That's usually a little easier, but that's normally the biggest mistake. Even when I bring it up, if I bring it up to an athlete, they're like, okay, I'll fix it. And then it's just immediately torque my whole body. And that's not necessarily what I'm looking for. So
Recently, I've also had a couple of athletes, and not that this couldn't be used in a drill setting, like for a feel, but they almost go too far with like not keeping in mind, like, hey, you have to like look at your target in game. And so we'll just like look over here at the wall. And this is during bullpens, even like where we're trying to get something out of it, not just throw as hard as we possibly can. And then it's like, they're like, oh yeah, my pin, and they're throwing it. I'm like, oh, I'm throwing 94. And then like, bro, I was in game today, I was 88, 90. What happened? And it's like, dude, you actually have to like keep your head here, and now you're not being able to create this like steep counter rotation angle. Like, you actually have to pitch, and they wonder why there's not this transfer. And it's not that like you can't say like, hey, just don't look at the play. Like, I just want you to feel this one time. But sometimes it's easy to go too far because you're seeing the numbers climb. Like, oh, I'm just going to pitch this way, and then you suck in game. And obviously, we've kind of just missed the whole boat at that point.
I think for me, one key that I wish I had understood earlier in my college career, and this comes more to like the pelvic rotation side of it and how the pelvis works, is that it's not necessarily just about like gradually allowing the pelvis to open over time. At least for myself and a lot of guys, like Garrett Cole being a good example, is it's like, how long can I delay that rotation? And then how we talk about the timing of the separation, like how late can we get that separation to allow it to just crisply unwind up through the chain? So not just like gradually opening the hips, but being able to hold it closed and then pop it open, and then everything can just really crisply unwind from that point. So when we talk about timing, I think Garrett Cole is just a great example of how late. Chris Cortez, another good example of you look at that graph specifically with his pelvic rotation. We can put it up on the video. It's just like close, 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 and then last second hips pop open, and then everything just unwinds in this really crisp, like quick format versus like gradually just like leaking open.
I want something that Hunter said, like as far as using the glove side, I do think there is like a purpose of the glove side in the role of separation, but I'm kind of like what he said, you're not just trying to like take the glove side as far back as you can and create this like massive stretch, especially early on. But I mean, if you just think of it in like a physics aspect, like getting your arms further away from your body is going to make it so that your shoulders and like, you know, upper part of your trunk do want to, I mean, have more resistance to rotation, so that, hey, when using the, you know, moving your arms and away from your body like at the right time can allow for the, you know, the hips to move underneath and give your upper body a little bit more resistance to rotation, where then you can just catch that energy kind of into the throw. So I would say, you know, a lot of guys do take the glove side and like try to just crank it. There is a use of the glove side in like, you know, delaying the rotation of the upper half, but it's not just like to just crank as much separation as you possibly can.
I will say another lesson that I learned personally from experience, like when I had my like big velocity jump and I started to figure some things out, I was having low back issues, and I didn't realize until after the fact like why this was all happening. But essentially what I was trying to do was I was really trying to like force hip rotation and power my hips through, and what was ending up happening was I was basically just like rotating everything as one big block, and I was jamming up my low back, and so it was just giving me continual like extension-based low back pain from trying to force the hips through. And as I was rehabbing back from that, and I was like tentative, right? I was trying not to re-aggravate my back, and I started to just kind of like think about relaxing my low back, relaxing my hips, and just like allowing my hips to get open, and suddenly I could actually feel the dissociation between the two, because I was just trying to think like relax the hips into landing, relax into rotation, as opposed to like violently fire everything through at the same time. So maybe speak to like, we can kind of more talk about like subjectively like our feels and stuff. What are the feels for you guys? Are you trying to like power everything through, or are you just trying to sit and relax? Is it like this very active rotation? How do you like actually create the segmentation and allow the hips to rotate independently of the trunk?
Before I answer that, like you're saying when you like kind of relax into that separation, did you feel like when you actually landed like you were in a strong position, or you just felt like, oh, I'm dissociated? You felt like a pretty strong position?
Yeah,
I feel like when I try to do that, I would say when I try to do that, like just relax here, I end up in a position where I'm like, oh, it'd be a little bit harder to kind of close this gap from like a relaxed separation versus.
You feel like you get too much separation when you relax. See, I was getting very little, and then to me, I had to relax to actually allow these two to dissociate, because otherwise it was just trying to violently rotate them all at the same. I just heard intent, like rotate your hips as fast as possible, and I just started doing that instead of allowing that to happen and then applying the intent and then closing the gap.
Sure. I think for me, I mean, I'm kind of relying on some sort of move from the lower half to actually like initiate that, and then when that's actually happening, that's when I'm kind of like using the glove side to delay the upper half a little bit, and then just kind of trying to catch it into the actual throw.
I mean, I'm really not feeling too much. I'm really not like, I'm not technically looking for a feel. The only thing that I'm trying to do is block and not have an early torso. Like, if I can handle those two things, then I've set my body up where it needs to be. Mainly because I was so quick. Like, everything that I was doing was so completely speed-based. Like, I was going here trying to get down the mound as quickly as possible because I have so much length and, like, you know, like so much extension. I knew that I could just rely on my adductors to actually help me close the lower body gap. And then the only thing I needed to worry about after that was blocking and not having my torso be out in space somewhere, just because it was just too much of a.
When you think about keeping the upper half closed, because I agree that is like a piece of being able to maximize your separation and sequencing and everything, is like not just landing completely open. Do you think of that more from like trying to hold the upper half closed, or are you kind of like, if you can keep the pelvis closed it holds the upper half closed. Are you trying to address it from there, or are you trying to address it from here?
I mean,
Or a combination of both?
yeah,
maybe?
probably both, but it was more of like I was using the glove arm direction to actually lead me where I wanted to go. So I didn't have to add any more to it, just because it was, since it's away from my body, I can see it. Therefore, I know where everything is. So if I was taking my body this way, my torso was going here, just basically trying to create a straight line out in front of me. And that was the only thing I thought about, other than trying to think about what this entire piece is doing. Just thinking about where my glove was always easier.
Without letting your glove arm get too far back.
Yeah, without going this way. But it was like I used it as like a click point, because I knew things started having to happen, so I just would turn it there. Even because if I was turned sideways, it's literally just that. But I was already open this way. So I was already using it as a way just to take me back neutral.
Gotcha. Yeah, for me it was kind of like, because I can't think about like too much at once. I just go into overload, and I think a lot of guys are that way. For me, if I just thought about like staying sideways from my pelvis, if I could just keep my pelvis sideways, then everything else, like my glove arm figured itself out, my front shoulder trunk figured itself out. Like as long as I could just keep this sideways, like I would tell myself, like imagine there's like a laser pointer from that front hip to the target, and like stay there as long as possible.
See, that was where we differed.
Yeah.
Where it was just like I wanted everything to be open, and I wanted to be able to do it all up here. But it was mainly just because I knew what was going on down here. I have a hard time relaying information with my torso. So it was just like, if I just go ahead and do the one thing I know I can control, which is everything down here, then the torso should be in a good spot.
And it speaks to like a cue will be interpreted completely differently by each guy. Like if your lower half is on lockdown and like your upper half sucks, like maybe you need an upper half cue, and that's your entire focus is on that. And if for me it was just like my pelvis sucked.
Yeah.
So like that needed to be where my focus was. But you can't necessarily have the same cue will be interpreted completely differently, but for two different guys.
Yeah.
I think it's worth mentioning. So I feel something very similar to Hunter's. Like when I'm throwing well, I don't think I feel anything with my back leg. But what we repped like for months and months and months were like Stephen Jones pre-turns. And so like just selling out for the block over and over again. It's like in the beginning when we were first doing those pre-turns, I think we probably were thinking a little bit more in terms of like what we were actually doing the lower half. But then you get hundreds and thousands of reps of these pre-turns where we're just like selling out for the block, that eventually you develop this like subconscious confidence to where now that's just gonna happen. I don't even have to think about it. And that's what almost allows us to think like only upper half. And so like in the terms of like that we don't feel anything, I think in the beginning we probably did, like when we were patterning that, but then over thousands of like conscious reps, it came to a point where you don't even have to think about it. Now all I feel also is like I'm just gonna block and I'm just gonna try to keep my upper half a little bit closed. So just like adding the context in of, yeah, I don't feel anything, but there was like a conscious like protocol or like program to like almost get to that point. Like we were doing thousands of these reps, like trying to fix the back leg per se.
Can you explain and kind of demonstrate what you're talking about with the different blocking movements? Like what was the thought process of like, are you trying to just like actively like get the hips open while keeping the trunk closed? Are you more just thinking about like getting a firm block? Like what was that process?
Right.
That sounds like one of the big keys for you in terms of figuring this all out.
I think it's like a reverse chaining of the block. So I think like a progression would be maybe you start with just like walking into it, the only goal being that I'm gonna land completely braced. And it's not so much as this is what we want to do on the mound. It's that for guys that are a little bit soft or a little bit closed or whatever, if you sell out to just be open and braced, that you'll land closer to that position when you pitch. And so like a progression would be like, all right, I'm gonna like walk into it, land completely braced, and then maybe you slowly start to get sideways. And then like you can do things like hold tension longer, time that rotation later. And I would almost view those as like optimizations of that move, rather than like the move is to like block, land braced, and then you get better at timing it later and holding more tension as like an optimization of that move. And then it comes over to the mound and you
know, yeah, I mean, even on the separation point, like we were doing full plates with an actual turn, like everything was sort of like wiring itself into that without having to consciously always think about what my body was doing. I think at the time when we were doing stuff together, it was like both of us were just really bad in general and really bad about thinking about what we were doing. And this kind of took some of the like conscious effort out of thinking about what we were doing and making it a lot more subconscious into, okay, this is the only thing that we're working towards. And we're going to sell up for the fact that it's going to reverse chain everything. We won't have to worry about anything. I think both of us had enough knowledge at the time to understand that both of our arms were good. Our lower halves were suspect and our torsos were not great. So we basically just, like you said, we just reverse chained the idea of it, started at the bottom, and then kind of rewired everything on the way up.
Can either of you speak to like what you're feeling in terms of the actual rotation? Because we've talked about like the feel of like, I think maybe you said your feel is like back knee dropping down to the ground, but that being more like feel versus what's actually happening.
Right.
Can you talk through that process of like when you actually get to that point of like you haven't landed yet, but you're about to initiate the rotation?
Right.
What are you feeling? For me, it's just like it's holding tension and then relaxing the pelvis open. I think you were talking about the knee like driving down. What's your feel
for
there?
me, it's definitely two. I think my foot actually plays like a decent amount. So like I'm very like ball of the foot driven, like almost initiate this rotation with the back foot rather than like at the hip or like at the pelvis or anything. And so like what it is, like if even though my foot's like on the ground, almost all my weight is on the ball of the foot. And then it's like just relax, almost like sink the pelvis in behind the lead leg so that when the block happens, like your center of gravity is actually behind the block rather than what can happen with the guys, I think, is like they get on top of it and they don't get as much out of it. So I think that would be my feel, is like I'm just going to be like dropping the hips behind the lead leg is kind of my cue.
I can personally say I've never felt like what they're talking about at all. So that's where I feel like a lot of people like do things differently, and there's going to always be a lot of different ways to throw hard. But I mean, for me, I would say that it's more of a, not just hips rotating, but actually like getting some level of like actual rotation where the front hip actually gets lower, like creating like a little bit bigger of a stretch there versus trying to do it like with my foot. I just never felt, and I don't know, it might be a foot limitation or something like that, but I've never felt kind of that feel for the block. I've always kind of felt like, all right, I'm just trying to basically, get the hips and the shoulders to kind of not work together, but like work in sync, and then not actually try to like block super hard. So I feel like if you were to force plate their lead legs and force plate mine, in theory, I think mine would probably be lower because I'm not like actively selling out for like take as much weight into the ground as I can to actually like, and then transfer it up to the arm. For me, it's more like, all right, just let the actual rotation kind of everything flow up from there to the arm.
This also kind of comes back to like it's like our perceptions of what the feel is, like your perception of what's actually happening. So like maybe your lead leg is actually producing more force than Drew's,
right,
but like none of your brain's focus or awareness is on the lead leg.
Right.
So like you would explain it to somebody as like, I don't feel my lead. I would explain the same way. I would never think about my lead leg. Like if I start thinking about my lead leg or my glove arm, like screws everything up. Like my focus is stable backside, center of the body, pelvis, and like that's it.
True.
But it's like where is your attention and your perception? Like you can't think about everything at once. So it's like putting it in the specific part of your delivery or mechanics where it's like most beneficial for you. But I think that's why we get such a wide array of like explanations and feels, but also why it's valuable for people watching is like they might hear one specific way of describing this and like that's what resonates with them and clicks. They can go test that and trial that, and like that's ultimately what gets the transformation for them. Any other specific exercise we might want to talk about, or just like general principles? Like I think we talked about the plane specificity. So if you're going to just go do a bunch of like rotational movements to try to like work on this, do we want to be doing more just like pure rotational things, more like downhill types chops? Do we think that's all eyewash? Like what are your takes?
Yeah, I'm on board with that's all eyewash, but I think that there's at least some value in doing stuff that's on a slope that's not shot put or pure rotational, because that is pure eyewash. I think that there's some use in having at least something stacked overhead to where you actually feel like you're driving something with the arm that you actually throw with, instead of just having two hands on a ball and swinging it in a circle. Especially if my goal is to actually teach separation, then I want to throw because it's the only one thing that I have to do anyways. But if I want to drill it, I'm probably going to drill it with something overhead as well. And probably with a leg kick because that's the only time you really ever use it anyways. So probably a med ball like overhead chop, even if it's down into the ground where I can actually feel my torso turning completely over. That's probably what I would do, but probably nothing this way.
I would definitely agree. Second that, just from the feel of it. Not that those can't be beneficial from just like training like obliques to be explosive and all that in the weight room, but from a trying to transfer movement pattern standpoint, like I've definitely felt like shot put just like feels wrong, the plane that it gets you in.
Correct.
It's really, for me, it's again, it's like the high to low chops. It's something where you actually feel that pattern is the only thing that remotely mimics that same like downhill plane. High to low chops on like a Kaiser. So like that's another one where I've felt to some extent like getting up here and actually trying to feel like hips go, and then you're actually in the same.
Yeah, that one's just
same downhill
it's really
plane.
butchered though.
It's very easy to butcher that because on a cable machine, on a Kaiser, like you're not getting that decel piece of it that we talked about. Like you're not getting like, you're not opening the gap and then closing the gap and decelling. It's just like open the gap and then just like how far can I just continue to apply force in one like continual range of motion.
Yeah, I'd say in most aspects though, like anything that you can do rotationally is going to be good for training your obliques anyways. So it's not like I'm hating against shot puts or rotational med ball throws because I mean, it's not like I haven't done them. But in terms of specifically when we're talking about separation, I just don't feel it. I never felt it when I did it for hitting. That's why I just didn't do them.
Moral of the story being there, like, hey, use sledgehammers and med balls and whatever you want to train like rotational strength and power, but don't try to necessarily mimic your delivery with those pieces just because it will never be the same as an actual throw.
Yeah.
I will say for somebody who's like, this is all completely foreign to them and they're like, I don't have any idea if I'm separating or not. I mean, first off, you could just like look at video and just like ballpark be like, okay, at landing, are you 0 degrees, 45 degrees, 90 degrees, and where's your trunk? 0 degrees, 45 degrees, 9 degrees. Like you can ballpark see where you're at, like within 10 degrees just from video. But I think just for like feeling what it's like to have some degree of separation between the two, one that I really like is the Swiss ball cable chop on a Kaiser. Again, it doesn't perfectly mimic it, but like you basically have a ball on the Kaiser machine, 10, 20, 30 pounds, something, and you rotate. Because you now have weight holding your upper half back, your hips are not constrained. You're able to get the hips open and feel the upper half held back and still have to close the gap. So for me, that's like one feel that I can use to show guys like, hey, here's like what it feels like to even like get some stretch and some contraction. If they've never even felt it before, have no idea what we're even talking about, no idea like if they're doing it right.
I think another one too is like the barbell on the back. I know we talked about this the other day. I think that would probably be my personal favorite, just not from like mimicking mechanical standpoint, but like just feeling like how to control this weight on your back and like feeling the flow of everything. Like if you go too fast, like that's gonna be ouchy, like hurting the low back, whatever. But also if you go like too early, like it just feels ridiculous. You can feel there's no tension here. It just gives you a ton of feedback with that bar on your back and like the weight of the bar pulling the upper half, and you really feel how to control that flow of energy, in my opinion.
Should we get a bar out here and have them demonstrate that?
Yeah, I'm in agreement with that as well. The overall feel of it, it's if you mess up with a 45-pound bar on your back, you know, because it hurts.
If your training age is a little lower, maybe don't start with a 45
Yeah, maybe
pound
don't
bar.
start. Maybe
PVC.
start with the easy curl
Start
bar.
like PVC or whatever.
Easy curl bar.
I do think there's value though to having some weight here. The PVC doesn't give you any sort of
True.
feedback. You're like, what am I doing? But having like a 15-pound like girl bar or something, like I think would be a good place to start.
Yeah.
But if you want to just kind of go through like what your thought process with this and how do you use this? Is this like a warm up? Is this just
I
like
think-
spinal hygiene type thing in your warm up, or is it more patterning?
I definitely do a lot of like spinal hygiene stuff, not even trying to feel this necessarily, but almost just like get going, like lateral flexion, things like that. As far as like this exact drill or like feel that we're talking about, I would probably, if I was doing it personally, would just go like right foot forward, almost like pivot pick style, and then just feel like this, just that kind of like circular motion. And then just letting that like almost kind of dictate, all right, like I feel it loaded back here. Now I'm good to rotate out of it. And then just kind of feel that relationship between that tension just across here, the oblique sling, and then just kind of controlling that weight over and over. I think you can do a left foot forward as well, but I think at these like low speeds, it may be a little bit harder to create that stretch effectively.
What's the progression from there? Like, will you do, like one of the ones I'll do is I'll actually go through like a full like load, unload, stick, lead leg, back. Like, do you have any progressions from there? Or are you just trying to feel a relationship, or are you trying to like work on getting like more sideways, getting a load, and then unloading and blocking through that as well?
I think me personally, I'm just trying to feel the relationship, and then I would probably just go straight to the plyo wall and almost get into like a 10 toes or like a pivot pick with a full arm swing, and just trying to like almost mimic that exact same like tempo or feel. And that'd be mine. Do you want to demonstrate like what you're talking about with the?
So I was just messing around with it a few months ago because I saw you playing with it, and I was like, let me kind of get some of my own feels. But for me, trying to feel like the relationship of getting the trunk and the pelvis in the same plane. So if I just get this rotation purely from my spine, like that doesn't feel good. But if I allow my back hip to take up that slack, and then I am able to get the hips go first, and then get back downhill, and then block on this lead leg. But if I try to, like, if I have this coming one way, and then I try to fire my hips too early, you feel all that in your low back. So it's about like, it really exaggerates the movement and helps you feel not just that trunk pelvis relationship, but like if I get overly extended, it pulls you off. If you get way too forward, it pulls you off. Way too back here, way too back here. So it keeps you stacked, and then it also gets the timing of everything. You can really feel like the relationship between the two and how to capture that wave of energy. And so I'll kind of cue like a little bit of coil, feel that tension on the back side versus in my back, and then a little bit of elevated glove side. Hips go first, downhill, reverse it. So almost just like if you're gonna do trunk twists in your warm up or like some sort of like core warm up, just subbing it out for a 15 to 45 pound bar.
Yeah, I would much rather do that than pretty much anything else. Yeah, I mean, it's just kind of at least this has a bang for my buck where at least I feel hot.
Do we want to talk about roll-ins at all? Because I know that's kind of a controversial topic. Can we maybe explain like if you have a strong like story or opinion on like roll-ins, because like that's commonly used as like a prescription drill, like, oh, you have bad separation, do roll-ins, bad separation, do roll-ins. I know we all have our own stories, but maybe just like go through, share your story, and like, do you think that's applicable to everyone or just like certain guys?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much use it for everybody. Some people are going to hate that idea, and that's fine. I don't care.
Definitely, all our coaches do not do that.
Yeah,
but like
no,
some
nobody else.
Some certainly
Yeah,
do.
probably just us two. Probably universally, not as much, but I just like it. It's my favorite drill to coach out of. Like, I can get a lot done in the drills. That's why I want to use it. Like, it doesn't matter. Everybody else can have their own opinions about it, but essentially all I'm using it for is to find out what the athlete feels. Where do you find out what's going wrong? 99% of issues are early torso and late block anyways. So if I can at least figure out where you understand how your body is, because I don't remember if I said it earlier or not. I don't feel things in my torso very well, but I can see my lower half, so therefore I understand what it's doing. So for me, it was always like I can use a roll-in simply just to understand that my lower half needs to get here, and I know that if I got here and blocked, that my torso is back. I wasn't worried about it ever going forward, because if I did this and executed this really well, then everything else took care of itself. I know for certain athletes, it's more of a torso thing where they get super on the mound, they get super this way and shifted, so they kind of lose their center of mass going this way. So I like using roll-ins, so that way you can actually feel your center of mass be in extension and behind your front leg, so that way you can feel the chain kind of unwind forward this way. But yeah, that's typically what I use it for, because it's my favorite one to coach out of.
I will say one risk I see with roll-ins is like, there's a reason that most guys, like hard throwers, don't land like with 90 degrees of pelvic rotation. Like, there's a reason you see like 30, 40, 50 degrees, because that allows them to still get their trunk closed. So some guys will, if they completely just sell out for here, it's like they only have the mobility to land like here with their upper half. Maybe they still have 45 degrees, but it's 90, 45, and like you're not able to actually get the front side closed that way. You have 45 degrees of separation, but that separation, 45 degrees, 45 degrees, which one's going to allow you to throw more strikes? I would argue the one where you actually keep your upper half closed and like on line with the target.
Yeah.
So that, I guess that could be one like risk to watch out for.
Yeah. And I've always been super vocal about what your glove set actually does for you command wise, because that's something I struggle with. I think for like, it depends. This is just how I'm going to do it. I have a ton of internal anyways, so it's kind of like I can spin to whatever I want to. I mean, I have some guys who start at more of an angle this way who aren't getting as open, but they're still accomplishing the same things. But it's going to depend on athlete bias at the end of the day, kind of how they actually view throwing versus what prescription I give them. So that's kind of, I'll just modify it based on how I see fit, how, their throwing actually tells me what to do. So usually that's.
What are mistakes you'll see on the roll-in? Any of you guys? If you do use that with an athlete, like what's a common way you might see them cheat it or like?
Yeah, it's cheating it, and it's also just for extending out of it. Like they don't necessarily just trust like this relaxation like down into it, and you'll just see like this like hop out of it, which obviously just kills your ability to like uniformly gain speed. Like you just kind of like peak your speed really fast, and you're almost like decelling into foot plant actually, because you're just like crashing into it, and then block becomes late because it now has to absorb this force from this jump you just did, and then like ball's already out of hand, now you're blocking or whatever it may be. And so that'd be like what I see the most often is like this little like jump, like extension out of it, rather than almost just cue I use with a lot of my guys, like just feel like you're walking, because that's like walk-ins, roll-ins, it's like literally just like if your stride is half of what you think it should be, like that's fine as long as we're like getting into the ground and like upper half like feels, because it's just a drill at the end of the day. Like we're not going to pitch out of this. And so that's the main thing is like just almost using it to cue relaxation rather than like I'm not super in on just like, I think back in the day we used to just test roll-ins, for instance, and our plyo velos and things like that. I'm not sure I'm as on board with that anymore, just because I think it almost just promotes you to just be like, and then now you're just almost like trying to just create as much speed as you can towards the wall or towards the net or whatever it may be. Whereas now I almost use it more as like a foundational drill just for like feeling like relaxation and like just kind of staying relaxed, I guess.
When you think of the goal of a roll-in, is it, so I always thought, so I guess first off, like I didn't have a name for roll-ins when I started doing roll-ins. Like roll-ins were not a thing. Like it was, I had my own like version of, I would just call it a separation drill. This was like 2012. I was just trying to figure out how to stay closed. And so for me, the way I like came up with it was I would basically put back leg forward, try to lock my hips forward, try to lock this close, and try to hold that relationship as I move forward, feel the load, and throw. And in my mind, I was locking my hips forward, but I think why it actually helped me gain 3, 4, 5 miles an hour was because I actually wasn't doing that. I wasn't just like here and throw, like my hips actually what happened was I was keeping this back foot forward. And so that's what was actually happening is I was creating tension over this back leg, even though the pelvis was actually not staying. In my mind, what I thought I was doing was I was keeping everything forward, but what I was actually doing was keeping the back foot this coiled, and then I was able to actually create tension and rotate out of it. And so like in retrospect, I figured out like that's actually why the roll-in worked for me, and like I got this big velocity jump was because it taught me how to create tension, but it actually wasn't just like coasting through and landing 90 degrees open with my pelvis. It was, so are you thinking of it like you want to see their pelvis fully open? Are you thinking of it like you just want to keep that back foot as on target as they can for their mobility? What are you looking at specifically there?
I don't even coach the drill that specifically, I think. Like, I'm not looking for, like, those supers. I don't want to see him, like, cheat it enormously, but if you see a guy, like, if the throw's just good, the throw's good. So it's not like I'm not going to sit here, if your pelvis closes a little bit, like, no, open. Or, like, if your foot opens a little bit, but the throw's still electric, like, I'm not going to coach that either. So I think it's almost like allowing room for the athlete to do exactly what you did and almost just find it on their own. And you can kind of see things, like, is this clicking or is it not? You can add variations, pull the plug, whatever you need to do. But I almost think like coaching the drill that specifically is counterproductive most of the time.
Allowing them to self-organize to some extent. You're either to give them like general guardrails within exploring the movement, but like allow them to explore the movement at that point.
I've coached at that specifically a few times, just when the throw is garbage, right? Like if the throw looks terrible, I'll get really specific, like, hey, like this is the general idea, and most of the time they won't get close, but they'll start getting closer to kind of how I want the throw to look. Not necessarily like it has to be pelvis, gotta be open the whole time. For me, that's just how I like doing it. It's just how I start. That's how I learned. So it was just like I liked it when my pelvis stayed open. So I probably turned a little bit, but
it's like one of those things too. Like it's probably better to over exaggerate things when you're learning them than it is to like try to just chip away a little at a time. So like if a guy lands super closed, it's probably like, and what Hunter's alluding to is like, dude, just do not let it close at all. Stay open, knowing that they're gonna like leak closed a little bit. And so that I think I do that as well. Like if a guy's just not even close, it's like go to the complete opposite side of the spectrum and feel that in the hopes that they like meet in the middle instead of like just like, oh, that's a little bit more open. That's a little bit more open, like chipping away at it, and that takes a lot of time.
How does this conversation change for like maybe like ER, IR guys? Because like we're kind of sitting here talking about roll-ins and like all have pretty good internal rotation. Like how does this conversation change for someone who's like, they even think about keeping their back foot forward and they're like, it just like does that? Is it just like scrap roll-ins are just not good for that guy? Like what are some other drills or alternatives you might use for certain guys?
I think you become lateral at that point, or you can take it like a jab roll-in, even if it's where it's like you're feeling the torso start a little bit open, the pelvis a little bit open, and then allowing them to actually come back to the bias of this to pull through. I still think it works kind of the same way. I think it turns into kind of like a modified shuffle at that point though. So I don't know that it's necessarily the same, but to some extent, unless a guy just has like no feel for what his foot's actually doing, I'm probably still going to use it. Unless it looks terrible, then I'll scrap it.
I can speak on this a little bit. Do you guys, when you guys do roll-ins, do you feel like you're trying to almost keep the torso like upright or back? Mm-hmm. So like whenever I tried to do roll-ins like that, it just felt horrible. It just didn't feel like a normal throw to me. So I threw pretty hard out of them, but the biggest thing for me was like actually keeping the torso look a little bit forward and letting, I don't think I have as much IR as either of you. So being more so like, all right, I'm letting the the pelvis close and the foot actually spin a little bit, and then still getting the same thing out of the drill. Like, but instead of like trying to keep everything kind of sort of open and lean back, like I got more out of it when I was forward to try to like basically catch separation out in front. So I think there's more than one way to do roll-ins, I would say. And I've seen, a lot of guys that can't throw hard out of it one way, they try something different, same drill, just done differently, and all of a sudden the ball kind of comes out. So
at the end of the day, the throw tells you everything you need to know.
Right.
So like, it's always case by case. It's never, this is just how we did this every day for months, for hours. So it eventually just kind of ingrained in us. I'm not saying that's the best idea to do. It was like 105 outside, like probably wouldn't do that. But it's just kind of how we ingrained it. It's a little easier to teach because we did so much of it. But it's always case by case. If the throw looks like trash, it looks like trash. Like I'm not stuck in my ways to where I have to do roll-ins. And I have some guys who don't do roll-ins at all. Like I have some guys who don't even throw plyos. So like I'm not stubborn enough to allow the drill to hold me hostage.
Generally speaking, like if somebody's watching this and they're like, I'm hearing what you guys are saying, but I'm not exactly sure if I fall into the bucket of like, I need to work on this, or if it's okay, like how might they kind of have a general idea of like, am I in a good spot? Like we've thrown out like the general like 30 to 50 degree-ish separation, but then again, like 30 to 50 where you're landing like completely open might be different from 30 to 50, but you're landing like overly closed and you're back here. How would they know, like, is this something they should be working on?
Film it and send it to Corey Wilder, Instagram.
Just get somebody who knows what they're looking at to.
Yeah.
You're saying if they're looking at video of themselves do it, or if
right, like
just
not everybody watching this like has a hip shoulder separation issue.
Right.
but so they might not need to go and like try 20 different drills, like work on it because it might not be an issue for them. What are some like signs that this is a huge issue? Like back leg kicking way off, hips and shoulders rotating as one unit. Like
It's, I don't know. I feel like it's hard to tell unless you're like absolutely dialed in on looking at video and you actually have a decent video to look at. Because like when I think of somebody actually watching their videos, usually it's that one that they film, that their mom filmed through the net. It's really grainy and you can't actually see anything happening.
okay, what is really bad hip shoulder separation look like? Right, it's a blocky rotation. Like
Yeah, it should feel like, I don't know how to describe it. You should feel like you're not only are you moving slow, but you should feel like your whole body just moves in ice. It's just like everything feels like it's frozen. Doesn't feel like anything's going on.
on video, you'll typically see like back, hip, and trunk. Like you'll literally see like everything rotating as one unit versus there being some frame of space being created.
Yeah.
Again, I mentioned this already, but like when that happens, when everything rotates as one unit, it typically will pull that back leg off because as everything rotates as one unit, it forces you to have a very linear finish. And as you have that linear finish, the hip flexor kicks in. So you end up getting this like rectus abdominis finish, rotates together, linear finish, and that contracts the hip flexor and you get that action. So like the guys where everything just kind of block rotation and then just like crumples into release, back leg shoots way off. Pretty good sign, like separation is one of your main issues.
I think also just, I mean, I know when I was younger, like when looking at video, it was very hard to like see everything and while it's happening, but using certain positions, like, hey, when I'm actually, when the front leg actually, accepts some force, like, is the torso already even with the hips? Like that's probably telling you that at some point either the timing or the amount of separation like isn't right, or like, at a certain point with the arm, like is the torso, a certain amount closed or a certain amount open? Like I think using like certain positional markers when watching video is like the simplest way to kind of be able to see that.
I think there could be some clues as well. For like, and this is very muddy, but if you can 10 toes long toss 300 feet and then you get on the mound and it's trash or like it's still like 88, there's a good chance like the lower half is like in your way somehow. Like that's very muddy. Like, but separation could play in there. Like there will be clues. Like you'll be elite at some things. Like when you're forced to almost separate, like through some constraint, and then you'll unconstrain it, and now the timing's all muddy and like the separation is not there, and now you're like the numbers aren't what they should be. So I think there are cases where there's clues like that kind of like thrown in.
Just like differentials between all the different types of drills. Like same thing, like if you see a guy who's really good at shuffles and like throws 100 on shuffles and then throws 88 on the mound, like there's something going on with like his ability to generate momentum from a standstill, because if you just gift him the momentum, he can block it, transfer it, and he's great. And like suddenly he has to create it from a standstill. Like there's something going on with like that part of the throw to actually get things going.
Exactly.
So looking at like how well do you do on upper half only drills? How well do you do on upper half plus trunk rotation but with no hip rotation? How well do you do when you incorporate hip rotation? How well do you do when you turn sideways, add its linear move? How well do you do when you add a leg lift? How well do you do on the mound? How well do you do with a running start, long toss? And then figuring out like where is the disconnect happening here.
Exactly. And I think that's where like a pretty skilled coach comes into play as well. Like I think that's very hard as a new athlete. Those clues could be there, but when you don't exactly know what the values, like what values are good for a 10 toes, whatever, that gets very hard to decipher. And that's where like having a good coach as well is like, oh, your 10 toes number is actually elite. But then we get into whatever, like on the mound for, like obviously just not good. So just having a coach there that's seen enough volume of these drills and things like that to be like, this is actually like well above average, or this is worse than it should be based on this. Like having someone there to kind of like consult.
Can you separate optimally without stability from the back foot or stability from the back leg? Or are you almost like forced? Like let's say you're literally throwing on mud with the back leg. Like this, you're literally in mud. Can you separate to the same extent? Obviously you can like cheat it from up top, like you can separate. How important is the back side stability, back foot stability piece to actually being able to rotate effectively versus like, does your body default to like different types of patterns when there isn't that stability piece? How much harder is it to rotate?
I would say you can still separate and rotate without a stable base, but it's going to be I mean, at the end of the day, there needs to be some direction to the throw. Like, you're throwing it towards home. So, like, yeah, you can separate and rotate, but you need stability to actually kind of like guide you in a certain direction, and also kind of like, I think in some aspects, like initiate some level of rotation of the lower half and the hips. So that's kind of how I look at it. Like, you can still you can put me in midair and I can turn one way or another and then close the gap just using like my core and whatever in the kind of lumbar spine area. But there needs to be some level of, there's got to be some linear direction, and then there's, you want to be able to kind of initiate the hips at the right time depending on how you're actually rotating. So
it just gives your pelvis something to actually like rotate against almost.
Yeah.
Versus like, again, you gave like the midair example, like you can do it, but there's going to be nothing behind it.
Right.
I think similar like you're gonna limit the amount of like momentum or energy you can put, like you said, like you can rotate and things like that. And so like we talked about the pull downs, like there's not a ton of back foot stability there, like when it just like touches and snaps, but that momentum's already been created for you, so you don't necessarily need it to like be there to like build speed in that aspect. Whereas like on the mound, obviously you do, like you need something there to almost buy you time to let the slope create that speed for you. And so that'd be my position. Like, it just like really limits your ability to like gather momentum and then rotate, which I think is like the key. Because obviously just like sitting here and just going, like,
right, you could just lift your leg and separate, but you didn't actually create any sort of like linear move.
Exactly. I would say that's like the two pieces. And that's why like in pull downs, you've already got all of that created for you. And that's why you can just kind of like snap, open, block, and rip. And so that'd be like my thoughts.
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, if it was me, I could probably compensate out of anything. So probably find a way to separate regardless of what's in front of me, what's under me. But in general, it's just, you're not going to have the exact same ability to apply force without being as connected to the ground. Just how the way force is going to transfer up the body, you're just not going to have something to ground the force to be able to send it all the way up. So elite throwers will still compensate. They'll still be able to find a way to do the job and be able to throw the projectile as hard as possible. But yeah, it would be really hard to do without having some sort of stability. I just don't think you have to have as much as you really think you do.
How much does mobility training factor in? That's the one thing we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah.
It's like we talked about how like you have a certain amount of mobility as though like that's just like a permanent thing, and like figuring out what's optimal for you based on that. At what point do we know like someone comes in and they have like 10 degrees of thoracic rotation or something? Like, to what extent can we train separation from the mobility angle? Maybe not the patterning angle, which is like how do you know if it's like a structural thing that you need to train more in the weight room and in the corrective side?
I think one thing being like, hey, you're gonna, depending on how your posture and the torso is actually set up, like you're gonna be able to get a certain amount of rotation versus, hey, I'm already in a pretty good amount of extension. Like all of a sudden, motion in one plane is probably gonna limit motion in another a little bit. So like, I think just kind of like working separation drills sometimes can help you just feel the feeling of like, maybe not the exact amount of separation you'll get in a throw, but the feeling of like, all right, if I'm neutral and stacked here, I can actually, get more separation, and then trying to take that feel to the actual throw.
Yeah, I'd agree with that 100%. It's basically just like the more neutral you are, the more like free range you have to go in every direction. Whereas like if you kind of like cheat one way, like I think you're going to limit rotation. Like if you're one of these guys that get uphill super early, not that can't work for some guys, but I think as a general rule, like you just want to be like close to neutral, so that way you have like all these degrees of range in every direction to like utilize.
Gotcha. Garrett Cole being a good example of like holding that stacked posture as long as you can down the mound, because the second you get here, like it will limit your ability to like not just jam up on your own spine. Yeah. The second you get here, you can't rotate to the same extent.
For sure.
So so postural. If a guy comes in super extended, like doing some different postural exercises and cueing him that way on the mound,
right?
And then potentially like thoracic rotation stuff if he's just like super limited and just can't create any sort of, like if he only has 10 degrees of rotation in an assessment, like he's not going to get 50 on the mountain. Like that's going to be his ceiling.
One thing to touch on from what Hunter was saying, like as far as like being stable there too with the lower half, at the end of the day, the only like you're trying to throw the ball as hard as you can. So I mean, at the end of the day, you're trying to put force into the ball over the greatest amount of distance that you can. And so if the only thing you're worried about is rotation, like you're only covering so much ground, as where, hey, I'm using the rotational piece and the linear piece of moving down the mound. Like all of a sudden you're extending the amount of distance you're actually able to kind of apply force to the ball and end up throwing a little bit harder. So
That's about all I got. We'll cut it there, but appreciate you guys. Anybody has questions, drop a comment down below. We'll do our best to clarify things. But thanks for watching. Let us know if you have any topics for future Around the Mounds, and we'll see you guys next time.